in addition to a tough economy, is obviously a tight budget. Like state governments all across the country, we face a deficit here in Wisconsin at $3.6 billion. What we proposed in this budget repair bill 4 weeks ago tomorrow was an effort to not only get under control fiscal year 11, which ends at the end of June this year, but to prepare to get our budget under control for the next 2 years, starting July 1st, to put in place reforms ultimately that you saw in the bill that was passed last, or the measure that was passed last night in the state Senate, and will shortly be debated and voted on in the state Assembly, a measure that's really about reform. It's about giving local governments the reforms, and state government as well, the reforms they need to make government work better, to make government work for the people of the state and in each of our communities. Along with that, it also gives the tools not only to improve government for the people of the state, particularly the middle-class taxpayers of the state, but it ultimately allows us the tools at both the state and the local level to balance our budgets, and to balance our budgets not just now, but into the future. This is ultimately about a commitment to the future, so our children don't face even more dire consequences than what we face today. That's what this bill is all about. Now, in doing this, it's interesting because in other states where they're cutting billions of dollars from aid to local governments, to schools and local governments, they're not giving them those tools. And so one of two things is happening, or in some cases both. You're either seeing leading to actions in those states where you're going to see massive layoffs of workers and reductions in service, or you're seeing the potential for massive property tax increases, or in many cases the likelihood of both. To us, that's unacceptable. That would hurt the middle class in this state by seeing massive property tax increases and by seeing massive numbers of people laid off. We provide a better alternative that not only improves and reforms government, but allows us at the state and local level to do so while avoiding massive layoffs and avoiding massive property tax increases. To do that, we have a measure that has to reform the collective bargaining system in the state. It's what the Senate passed last night. It's what the Assembly is likely to pass today. This measure, for all the talk about what may or may not be in, includes not only the reforms in collective bargaining, it includes something that I believe the public overwhelmingly supports, and that is asking us as public employees, myself included, to pay a little bit more for pension, 5.8%, and a little bit more for our health insurance premiums, 12.6%, which if you ask the typical middle-class taxpayer in this state is far more generous than what they're paying. Most people in the state and the middle class are paying a whole lot more for health care and a whole lot more for the retirement plan. This is about protecting the middle class and doing it in a way that avoids massive tax increases and massive layoffs. We were able to get those savings. We were able, as was explained in the measure that passed the Senate, there was some talk that just the collective bargaining reforms would be in. No, we were able to get the 5 and the 12% savings. Multiple nonpartisan agencies that advise both Democrats and Republicans in the Senate advised us that this was a way to do that and still be in compliance with the narrow definition for the 3/5 requirement. That's why there was not a need for 20 senators to be in the Senate last night, and we've complied with that. We followed the law, and yet it allows us to move forward with these reforms, which are indeed fiscal. They're not in conflict with that requirement for a quorum, but they are indeed fiscal. They give a fiscal benefit to the state. For the remainder of this year, it allows us to save $30 million, which allows us to save 1,500 jobs. And for the next 2 years thereafter, the next budget, it gives us at the state level the equivalent of $300 million worth of savings, which allows us to save some 5,000 to 6,000 jobs. And it allows local governments to save nearly $1.5 billion because of these reforms, which saves the equivalent of 5,000 to 6,000 local government jobs. So in total, these reforms for the next 2 years give us the ability to save billions of dollars that ultimately will save anywhere from 10,000 to 12,000 jobs, depending on the local jurisdiction. That's what this bill is about. It's about reform. It's about making sure we can put people to work, we can save jobs, and ultimately balance our budget in a way that protects the middle class here in Wisconsin. And now, again, if you talk, and I've been around the state for weeks now, talking to factories, talking to businesses, talking to middle-class taxpayers, who in many cases are paying 25 to 50% of their health care premiums. In many cases don't even have a pension, and if they have some sort of retirement, it's a 401k where their employee matches what they put away, which is exactly what we're talking about here. In each of those cases, those middle-class taxpayers tell us what we're proposing is reasonable. It's reasonable. In fact, it's reasonable not only compared to those outside of government. If you look at the federal level, federal government workers are paying on average 28% for their health insurance premium. That's twice, essentially, what we're proposing for state and local workers in this budget repair bill. On top of that, it's important to remember that federal government employees, for the most part, do not have collective bargaining for wages and for benefits. So for those who tried to frame this as a debate about rights, it is not. Because if it was, ultimately federal government employees would have collective bargaining for wages and benefits. They do not. What we're asking for here, and what we're going to see passed today, I believe, in the Assembly, is more generous for government workers than what the federal government has when it comes to those provisions. Finally, I just want to say to the public, as I've traveled the state, what I've heard repeatedly, and we've got more than 150,000 emails of people for, against, and most people are somewhere in between. People appreciate what we're trying to do to balance the budget. They say the pension and health care contributions make sense. But what we've heard time and time again is, can't you find a way to move this forward? We want you focused back on jobs. We like the attention that you gave to jobs in the first month and a half. We want to get back to that. It was a bipartisan effort early on. We can get back to that once we get past this budget repair bill. They want us to move forward. For the last 3 weeks, we have reached out, particularly in the last 2 weeks, we have reached out to some of the reasonable members of the Senate Democratic Caucus. As all of you in the media saw in the last couple of days in the emails we released, time and time again, we reached out and thought we had not a deal, but the framework of a deal, a framework of a pathway home. And each and every time, Senator Mark Miller, the leader of the Democrats that are out of state right now, stood in the way of that agreement. We even saw it last night in his statement that first he was coming back and then he wasn't coming back. That's what we've been dealing with for the past several weeks. I think at that point we reached out every option possible. Yesterday, Senator Miller, instead of contacting me or sending a message to me, instead released a statement to the media before passing it on to us. And he said either change it the way we want or this is the end of communications. Well, we're willing to talk, we're willing to work, but in the end, at some point, the public wants us to move forward. We have a process that was passed in the Senate last night and one that the Assembly will be passing, I believe, later today that will allow us to move forward, allow us to get back to what our ultimate charge is, which is to put in place policies that help the people of this state, the private sector employers of this state, put more people to work. And when we do, we'll see far more than just 10,000 jobs created in the private sector each month. We're going to see a total over the next 4 years of 250,000 new jobs in the private sector, and that's ultimately going to get this state working again. So I think the people of this state have spoken. They want us to move forward. What I ask is, and I have respect, as I mentioned, for our public employees who obviously there's been a lot of passion, a lot of attention on this, who have still done the job that they're professionals in doing, and that is coming to work, doing the job, helping the people they love to serve. I thank them for that. I appreciate that. I respect them for that. And it's my hope that just as much as they've lived up to that level of professionalism, the folks who are at the Capitol today in particular, in the hours that come, in the days to come, will respect the fact that in this state, we can be passionate about our debate. And plenty of people have been passionate over the past month. But that we are civil in the state. We have a civil debate. We respect the law. We respect the rights of others to speak out for and against a particular measure. And up until now, we've been largely successful in that. My hope is, in light of the vote last night and again today, that we do not allow influences from outside of Wisconsin to come in our state and try and create some sort of chaos or something that runs contrary to the civility that we've shown throughout the past month and really throughout the past 163 years, it'll be in May, of the state's history that has shown that we can have passion. We can be bold, we can push for reform, but ultimately we're respectful to our fellow citizens in how we debate these measures. With that, I'll take some questions. For us, when we talked, and we had the Senate talk to 3 different agencies that are nonpartisan, objective agencies that provide counsel for both Republicans and Democrats alike, when it became clear that we did not only have to pass the collective bargaining changes, but that we could include the changes when it comes to the pension and health care contribution in this measure, which I've said all along is the key element here. Several weeks back, some have said they'd accept that. They didn't contradicted that in terms of what they did in local unions negotiations throughout the state of Wisconsin. But I said that is paramount in our discussions. It's the one thing I said I could not sell out local governments on. They need to have the tools to balance their budget. When it became clear that we could comply legally, the Senate could comply, now the Assembly as well, but the Senate particularly with their quorum requirement, legally, with the fact that while it is a fiscal impact to the state and local government, it does not have an appropriation, and they could comply with it. It was the counsel they were given. As long as we could move forward with that, with the package intact that we had asked for, we felt it was appropriate to move forward because, as Senator Miller said, he was only willing to talk if we were willing to take out the very thing that would help local governments balance their budget. He said, if you don't do that, our communications are over. To us, we decided at that point we had to have a different approach, a different strategy, and one that ultimately achieved what I think, again, the overwhelming message I've heard from the people of the state is, get it done, let's move on, let's get this past us. We think what you're asking for in the 5 and 12% makes sense. Let's just find a way to get it done. And I think that's where the frustration was. We thought up until that point, until those opinions came out, that it would have to be to break it into pieces and pass it or pass it intact. This was a way to pass it intact and still comply with the constitutional mandate. We had looked at other options out there, but again, that had not been clearly defined to the Senate in the way that they were comfortable. I was not. I've been here today. I'm going around the state just as I have been yesterday, and I was there for a little bit yesterday morning. But for us, obviously, we're concerned. I check in with my staff repeatedly. I've talked with the Secretary of Administration. He's been in contact with the judge who ordered, in the past, a court order not only in terms of access but in terms of safety. The judge, I think, is both very concerned about the handful of agitators who've caused some problems, making sure that they're not deterrents to free and open access to the body itself or to the Capitol itself. And our hope is shortly those individuals who are seeking to cause problems will not be there, and instead the general public that wants to come in and have their voices be heard can be there. But obviously, we ask again. We've seen for weeks now. We had a couple weekends where we had 70, 80,000 people at the Capitol. We had one weekend where about a third of them were probably folks that were for the bill, 2/3 were against the bill, and yet we didn't have any skirmishes. We didn't have any problems that particular Saturday. My hope is, again, that will continue. But again, you've seen some of the footage from last night, checking with individuals. There are people who are apparently looking to not obey the request of law enforcement to be civil about this. We want to make sure that everyone's safe, not just lawmakers, but that all the people who are going to be in the Capitol today and the days to come are safe. And we're going to continue to make sure we take the advice and counsel of law enforcement to make sure we can ensure that. Well, they've calmed things down. It's in this case what they've done, and again, they've conferred with the court to make sure the court is fully aware of this and is comfortable with this. But they temporarily last night shut the building down after the hours were closed. They reduced the number of individuals in, and what they've done in the past is asked largely for voluntary compliance. They're going to continue down that path. Again, people can have a civil, passionate debate about this. One doesn't have to offset the other. And it's my hope and my request to the people of the state is that they comply. But my worry, frankly, is people coming in from other states who aren't as interested in complying with the civility we've shown here in the state, not only lately, but throughout our state's history. I'll sign it as quickly as we can legally. Obviously, we're going to follow the law in terms of the timing that they get to us. But it's important for us, again, as I've heard from people all across the state, is they said, just can't we move forward? Isn't there a way to move forward? It's why we didn't do it publicly. For weeks, folks have asked me that, and we've been quiet about what we were doing to reach out in respect to those handful of responsible senators, reasonable senators who wanted to find a pathway back. We said we weren't negotiating in public with them. We talked about different ways, different options for them to come back. Obviously, there was no agreement, but we had the framework of an agreement, at least the start of an agreement, and each time Senator Miller stood in the way of it. Finally, on Sunday, he said he was coming back, and then Monday he changed again. They're at a point where it's been very difficult for those senators. I think not all of them, but a good number of them will be just happy to come back home, to get back to business, and to start working on things we've been working on together in the past. Sure? Sure. Well, in the public hearing, what they passed is no different than what the Joint Finance Committee had a 17-and-a-half-hour public hearing on, the longest in at least modern history, on a single piece of legislation. Conference committees in the past have not had, I don't ever remember when I served in the legislature, because a conference committee is not a new bill. It's essentially taking one house's position, the other house's position, and deciding what ultimately is going to stay in it. That's what they passed. In terms of legality of it, again, I was not a part of the Senate and part of doing that, but my understanding is the Senate chief clerk, an individual who's worked for Republicans and Democrats in several different tenures, Republican, Democrat, so this is not someone who's a Republican or a Democrat ally, advised the Senate as to the path, how they moved on that, and put out a statement that he believes, and he identified the rules and the statutes, that they're in full compliance with the law. What's your reaction to those comments of dirty trick? The dirty trick is what those 14 have played for the past 3 weeks. I mean, the fact of the matter is we live in a democracy, and to participate in a democracy, you got to be in the arena. And the arena is not in Rockford, it's not in Freeport, it's not in Chicago, it's in Madison, Wisconsin, our capital. And the fact that 3 weeks ago they gave up the right, every day they stayed out of the Capitol, to have a vote on that measure. You can't mail in your vote. You ultimately have to be in the chamber, and I think individuals who live, Republican or Democrat alike, in each of those 14 state Senate districts have to ask themselves, why was their senator not there? Day after day, week after week, we reached out, first through Senator Fitzgerald and then throughout my administration, to some of the more reasonable members of that caucus. And day after day, week after week, Senator Miller stood in the way, which really begs the question is, who's calling the shots down there? Is it Senator Miller? Is it his staff? Or is it the union leaders from Washington, D.C.? I don't know what the answer is, but I know the answer was somebody told them not to come up. And again, I think voters in those districts should ask why they were not represented on the floor of the state Senate yesterday. Well, I think, again, to a number of those senators we reached out on, we're going to try and find ways to work with them. Many of those senators had voted for portions of our special sessions jobs package in the past. Obviously, this has got a lot of national profile, but I served for about 9 years in the state legislature. I can remember, they didn't get as much publicity, but I can remember debates just as passionate as this. I can remember egos and tensions built just as much as this. I can remember back in 1995 when I was in the state assembly and Republicans first took the majority, there were people that tried to rush the speaker pro tem at that time and did all sorts of things. And in the end, things cool down. People move on. The most important thing for us, not only for the lawmakers, but I think for the public is, a couple months down the road, when people realize that all the things that were put up on TV by all this money coming in from Washington didn't happen, that what really is going to happen, and people will see in a couple months, are 3 things. Public employees like myself will pay a little bit more for pension. Public employees like myself will pay a little bit more for health care, but in both cases less than what the average middle-class taxpayer pays in the state for both of those. And third, public employees will no longer be mandated by law to be in a union. They'll have the choice to do that. They'll have the right to choose whether or not they're in a union, and they'll have the ability to collect, in some cases, up to $1,000 in union dues, and instead of having that automatically deducted from their paycheck, they'll have the choice as to whether or not they want to give that to the union, or whether they want to use that to pay for their health care or the pension or the kids' education or whatever else. Those are the things that will change. The rest of the things they talk about won't change. We have the strongest civil service system in the country. Workplace protections will continue. Those are not altered in this bill. In the same way that public employees at the federal level aren't dealing with chaos, even though they don't have collective bargaining for wages and benefits. The fact of the matter is we will continue to treat our employees well, but more importantly, the other thing I should add, there's 3 things that will happen in terms of employees. The fourth overall thing for the public is the other difference they will see, and I mentioned it in an editorial today in one of the national publications, is by reforming the government, we will give our schools and our local governments the tools they need to reward the best and the brightest. No longer will schools be forced to make staffing decisions, hiring and firing decisions based upon seniority and union contract. Instead, they'll be able to make